Good evening. How's everybody doing? Goodness, what day of the week is it? This is my edit bay right here. I'm cutting the movie that you've all heard about, Man in the Long Black Coat, and I'm just lost. I'm in another world. I come to edit the movie in the morning, and hours pass. I have just no sense of time. It's a wonderful feeling, this movie that Nina and I wrote, that it started several years ago, planning it, outlining it, writing it. And then all kinds of wonderful people came on board, investors, producers, cast. And then we shot it in November and December. And all along, as the director, I had this vision of what the characters should be like, what the actions should be. There's a lot of action in this movie. And some complex action, big gunfights, action scenes, as well as, taut emotional scenes. And in all that, as a director, it's my job to imagine how all of that is going to play on a big screen when the audience is sitting in the dark, expectant, saying, I paid my money, give me entertainment that is worth my time. And I imagined it all coming together. I hoped it would come together. I believed it would come together. I was confident that it would come together. But all of that is not the same as watching it come together. And, it's such a wonderful feeling seeing it all come together. But it's a lot of work. It goes on and on and on and on. Months of cutting it together, putting the pieces together, watching it mesh. It's a wonderful feeling, but it's a tremendous amount of work. And I'll tell you, if I didn't break to do my daf and teach this class, I'd just be in that world 12 hours a day, 16 hours a day, no let up. If you love what you do, you don't work a day in your life. How's everybody doing? It's good to be with you on a Tuesday afternoon, Yom Shlishi. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Bill in mid-Missouri, Lucy in Minnesota, Sharon in New Jersey, Renee in Indiana, Paul in the Great Northwest, Joe in the Inland Empire, Bella in Florida. And it glitched on me. Bella in Florida. There she is. Sam in Virginia. Paula says Shalom. Shandora in the Bronx. Zach Plotzker, our man in Henderson. Peggy in Colorado, Paula in Chicago, James in Indianapolis. Good to see your name here, James. Nancy in North Carolina, Sharon. My dogs go wild with the bird sounds. It must be the retriever in them. What can I tell you, Sharon? You're going to have to take them hunting. Let them exercise their instincts. Steve, shalom from Eastern Tennessee. Zach wishing us and the kids a Chag Sameach. Zach, may you and your family be blessed with a joyful, meaningful, kosher Passover. And so I say that to everybody here in our class. Belle, Texas is listening. Well, actually, 3 dogs, me and my husband. Thanks, Sal and Nina. And saying shalom from Tennessee. Bill, I got the same way when writing my thesis. Time? What's that? Is it a kind of food? Exactly. Jonathan, shalom to everybody. Peggy, when can we see a preview of your movie, please? Can't share anything yet. It's months away. But we're very excited. Let me see. What else does it say? And Melissa in Great Neck, New York, over there on the YouTube side. Aoife in Florida. Michelle in the house. Marie in Freeport. Michelle is in Washington State. Marjorie in Georgia. Yisrael Simcha says shalom. And Yisrael loves the new glasses. They're not so new. I hardly ever wear them. I really like them. I like the way that they look, but normally I wear those very lightweight rimless glasses, and these are quite heavy, and what can I say? I'm a wimp. It's like I don't like such heavy glasses on my face, so there's a limited amount of time that I can use these, but today they're in, and thank you. Okay, let's do this. Our daf today. Oh, and a little bit of housekeeping. So our daf today is page 64 here in Tractate Nazir, the 17th volume of the Talmud. We are in chapter 9 today, concluding Mishna number 4. We'll go to Mishna number 5, God willing, tomorrow. Now, we'll do a very short show on Thursday for page 66. However, that's the last page of the tractate, and normally we would make a siyum and have a little celebration because we're finishing Tractate Nazir and then opening the next tractate. We're not going to do the final Mishnah and the final Gemara, just very short, of our tractate on the day that we do page 66. We're going to leave the tractate unfinished. Why? Anybody can guess? Do you know? We learned this in Tractate Pesachim, the laws of Pesach, Passover, right? Pesach, Passover is next week, and Erev Pesach will be Wednesday, right? So the first Seder is Wednesday night. Wednesday, the day before the Seder comes that evening, busy day. If this was ancient times, the temple was standing, and we made our pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So that afternoon, we'd be slaughtering, right? Be shechting the Pesach, right? The Passover offering, the lamb or the young goat. And then that night, we would sit around together and eat that roasted lamb or roasted kid, the people who had agreed to do that together. There's no work allowed from noon on that day because we're so busy with the preparations for Passover. But what's also celebrated on that day, commemorated, let's say, is the redemption, the saving, the salvation of the firstborn, right? Referring to when we were slaves in Egypt, and on the eve of our departure from Egypt, what happened? The slaughter of the firstborn, right? The 10th plague that was visited on the Egyptians, which finally, Pharaoh and the Egyptians and everyone had enough. Let the Jews go. Let the slaves go. So what was the distinction made? The firstborn of Egypt and the firstborn of Israel, of the children of Israel. And we marked our doors, right, with some blood of the Passover lamb or the Passover goat. And the angel of death passed over our homes. And we commemorate that with a fast of the firstborn. So firstborn males, only firstborn males are obligated in this. Firstborn males are obligated in a minor fast, meaning a daytime fast, from sunrise on the day of, right, Erev Pesach, the day before Passover begins that night. Firstborn males would be obligated to fast, no food that day until we eat the Passover that night, until we eat dinner that night. However, because there's actually no scriptural source and no Talmudic source for that fast, Tainis Bechoros, right? Some say Tainis Bechorim. So the fast of the firstborn. It's not a halacha, it's a minig, right? A minhag, a custom. So because it's a custom, we can be lenient with it. And we override the fast of the firstborn males, meaning the firstborn, if your mom had 2 children and a girl was first, so that the younger brother doesn't have to fast. But if the oldest is a boy, a Jewish male, who's the oldest of his mother or of his father, so he is obligated in the fast. But because it's a custom, not a halacha, we override it for a sudas mitzvah. A mitzvah meal. So if on that day, in the morning of Erev Pesach, for example, you attend a bris, right, a circumcision, and what goes along with a bris is a meal, and that meal, it's a mitzvah to eat at a bris, right, to partake in this joyful celebration of a bris. So then even though the firstborn males are obligated to fast that day, for a sudas mitzvah, for a mitzvah meal, they break the fast, and then once you've broken the fast, you don't have to fast the rest of the day. you can't count on having a bris that day, right? The 8th day of some baby boy being born. However, you can count on somebody making a siyum on a tractate of Talmud. And we are going to save our final passage here in tractate Nazir for that morning. And then we'll make a siyum, and then I'll break my fast, and then we'll get on with the day. So we can't have a class that night anyway, so what we'll do is we'll have a special schedule. It'll be early. It's not going to be even noon. It'll be in the morning. I'm not sure exactly when, probably like 9:30 or 10 a.m. Pacific. We'll announce it on the morning of Passover. And we'll finish the tractate then. Nazir, take a bite, a small part of our festive meal, just so I break the fast, and then we'll do the daf of that day. Right? What's our next tractate? Is Sota. Right? So we'll open tractate Sota in a couple of days, and then that day we'll do whatever daf is of Sota that day. Then there won't be a class Wednesday night. We'll have it Wednesday morning. Thursday and Friday and Saturday, right? This is the first 2 days of Passover, full holiday. Then it's Shabbos. And so then we're going to owe 3 pages. So that's a little too much for a Motzi Shabbos show. So plus it's Passover, it's complicated. So we will post the Passover schedule, but basically we'll have a class like Wednesday morning, and then again on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday at noon. Then we'll be in 7th and 8th day Pesach. We might have a class that following Friday, but probably not. So we'll have holiday schedule. And we'll post that on the Facebook page. And also, you should already be subscribed to the Accidental Talmudist newsletter. And we'll always post, the AT Daily schedule in that. So if you're not already getting the email newsletter, make sure you're subscribed to that. Nina will post the link, but it's easy to subscribe to our newsletter. Just go to accidentaltalmudist.org. Okay, that's the housekeeping for now. And previews when we're going to make our siyum on Nazir on the morning before Passover. Okay, we pick it up today at 63b at the bottom. Our page is 64. So our Mishna number 4 here in chapter 9, taught how does one differentiate between a known and an unknown impurity? Right, so generally we're talking about known and unknown impurity with respect to a Nazir. So we're talking about corpse tumah, right? A Nazir is prohibited while he is in the days of his Naziris to become impure for the dead. He can't enter a cemetery. He can't embalm a body. He can't, participate in being a pallbearer, that kind of thing. But he might have crossed over a grave accidentally, not on purpose, and then he becomes impure for the dead, and then he has to restart his days of Naziris. However, we've established that there's something called tumah of the deep, impurity from the depths, right? And this is a grave that was previously unknown to everybody in the world. No one knew. And the example, sort of prototypical example, is some poor person was killed in an avalanche, in an avalanche, and then, months or years later, the body is discovered. And when the body is discovered, we realize, that we had walked over it, right? So that nobody knew that body was there, and so there's going to be certain leniencies that go on with that. So if a Nazir walked over that grave, that previously unknown grave, then he completed his Naziris and brought the offerings and shaved, and then discovered that he had become impure from the deep. So then he doesn't have to redo his whole Naziris, right? That's what we started talking about yesterday. Now, our Mishna said, how does one differentiate between known and unknown impurity? So if a Nazir descended to immerse in a cave, right? And then we saw 2 examples of why this Nazir might have descended to immerse in some kind of a spring pool, right? A pool fed by spring waters that's in a cave. Right? Pretty typical to have underground river, underground lake that goes through a cave. That's how the cave was formed. And so why did he go down there to immerse in that water? 2 cases were given. One is he became impure for the dead. through some other situation. Like the prototypical example from the Torah itself is that somebody dropped dead right next to him unexpectedly. So he was being a careful Nazir not to come near the dead, but it happened by accident. This person dropped dead. He came into contact with him, became impure for the dead. He has to go through that 7-day purification. That includes being sprinkled on the 3rd and 7th days with the waters of purification that include the ashes of the red heifer. Then at the end of his 7th day, and the second sprinkling that happens on the 7th day, he has to immerse in a mikvah, and then he waits till nightfall, and then he has completed his 7-day purification for being impure for the dead. Because he's a Nazir, he also has to shave his head, bring the offerings of impurity, restart the count of days, and observe his whole Nazirs again as if from day 1. So he has to immerse in a mikvah because he was impure for the dead. So that's one case where he goes into the cave to immerse in a mikvah, in a ritual bath that happens to be found in a cave. Or he never became impure for the dead. It was just summer and he was really hot and he went into that, cool waters in the cave just to cool off. Why is this relevant? Because after he goes into that water and comes out, then he sees, or someone points out to him, did you know that there was a corpse floating in that pool? Uh-oh, what happens then? All right. So the Gemara comments, so if a Nazir descended to immerse in a cave and a corpse was found floating at the mouth of the cave, so he is impure. And the Gemara comments, a floating impurity does not render a person or item impure in the case of a creeping animal. Now we're differentiating a different kind of tumah, a much lighter kind of tumah, ritual impurity. Corpse tumah renders you impure. You can't enter the grounds of the temple when the temple is standing for 7 days until you've had your purification. Creeping animal, like a dead mouse, a dead small creeping thing, you come into contact with that. It renders you tumah, ritually impure, but all you have to do is immerse in the mikvah, and that night you're pure. No 7-day purification, so it's a lighter type of tumah. So a floating impurity does not render a person or item impure in the case of a carcass of a creeping animal, as it is taught in a baraisa, with regard to the case of uncertain impurity, where an item might have touched something impure that was floating, right? You were in that body of water. You don't know if you touched it or not. Later, you saw this thing floating. Did I touch it? Did I not? I don't know. So in that case of uncertainty, you can imagine we'll be much more stringent with corpse tumah and its heavy tumah, and we could be more lenient with sheretz tumah, which is not, so significant, right? So in the case of uncertainty, we could be more lenient. So as it is taught in a baraisa, with regard to a case of uncertain impurity, where an item might have touched something impure that was floating, either in water in a vessel or in water in the ground. Water in a vessel would include a swimming pool because the water is not flowing through it, as opposed to water in a pool in the ground that's being fed by a stream and then is, outflowing. So either in water in a vessel or water in the ground. Water in the ground would be like a well. So then the item is pure. And Rabbi Shimon says if the impurity was floating in water, meaning it did not become impure, we don't say that because you might have touched it, you became impure. Rather, we're lenient and say you remained pure. So if the impurity was floating in water that was in a vessel, then the item is impure. If the impurity was found in the water, it is pure. That's Rabbi Shimon's more stringent opinion, distinguishing water in a vessel from water in the ground, water in a pool, in a, a fed pool that has a stream through it. But the law is actually the more lenient case, that even water in a vessel, if you were in it and there was a creeping thing and you're not sure whether you touched it or not, you remain pure. Now we're at the top of 64a. What is the reason of the first Tana for declaring that in all uncertain cases of floating impurity, the person or item remains pure? Why do we have this leniency? And Rabbi Yitzhak bar Avudimi says, in the passage dealing with the impurity of creeping animals and the prohibition of eating them, it is written, right? So these creeping animals, that they're not kosher, with any swarming thing that swarms. We see that at Leviticus 11:43, indicating that a carcass of a creeping animal renders items impure in any place where it swarms. And where do these creeping animals swarm? On land. And it is written, all swarming things that swarm upon the earth, at Leviticus 11:42. So indicating that it transmits impurity only if it is on the earth. How so? How can one reconcile these two verses? Definite contact with it renders one impure. One who has uncertain contact with it, for example, the impurity is floating and you don't know if you came into contact with it or not, that person remains pure. So the Gemara asks, and Rabbi Shimon, who disagrees and says that, well, if you were in a vessel of standing water, you and this floating, creeping thing, then the uncertainty is going to lead to declaring that you are impure, and you have to go, you have to immerse in a mikveh and wait till nightfall. So what is Rabbi Shimon's reason for his more stringent opinion? And Ula said that it is as it is written, Leviticus 11:36, nevertheless, a fountain or a cistern in which there is a gathering of water shall be pure. And this indicates that a creeping animal found in one of these places does not impart impurity as opposed to water in a vessel. And it is written in the same verse, he who touches their carcass shall be impure until evening, which indicates that it does render one impure. How so? Well, if the impurity was floating in water contained in vessels, the item it touched is rendered impure. But if the water was in the ground itself, like a spring or a pit, then the item that it touched is pure. That's Rabbi Shimon's reasoning. The sages taught, and now they seem to be changing the subject, but we'll see how we come back. The sages taught all items that impart impurity, that are carried by human hand or that are dragged along, are not considered floating impurities, despite the fact that they are in motion. Rather, in a case where there is uncertainty whether a carried or dragged item affected a person, the individual is rendered impure because the items are considered as though they were at rest. And in the case of items that are thrown by people, in certain cases that pertain to them, the individual remains pure. We don't have to get into the particulars of this. This is like a little bit of a separate body of law of what renders, what transmits impurity and what does not. Now, this is the law except for an olive bulk from a corpse, which transmits impurity through uncertain contact, even if it was thrown, and that which overlies impurity when thrown. For example, an item might have been positioned over a corpse when it was thrown, and anything that renders items above it impure, like it, renders those below it impure. And to what does this last clause refer? It comes to include a zav and a zava. So these are people who've had a gonorrheal or some other kind of in the case of a man, a semen-like discharge that's more like gonorrhea, and in the case of a woman, a menses outside of her expected time of the month, who renders items placed above and below them impure even without contact. So if something thrown or floating might have come into contact with this man or this woman, the zav or the zava, so then it is impure. Now, with regard to this law of a floating impurity, Rami Bar Chama raised a dilemma. So, now that we've established some, principles, so now we're going to ask a series of questions. If there is a corpse in a vessel, right? So a vessel, now we've been talking about water in a vessel, and a person and a creeping thing are both in the vessel. So we're going to say that we're not sure if we touched the creeping thing or not. So there's a leniency and you remain pure. However, if there's a corpse in a vessel and the vessel itself is floating on water, and one did not overlie it but might have touched it, what is the law? Do we go according to the floating vessel, or do we go according to the corpse, which is resting on a solid surface, right? It's a body in a boat. You touched the boat. You didn't touch the body. Is that going to shield you from impurity or not? Well, if you say we go according to the vessel and one is rendered ritually impure, so then the following question arises: if a corpse is placed on top of the carcass of a creeping animal, a sheretz, so which is floating on the water? So what is the law? Do we say that since this impurity of a creeping animal is an impurity for an evening, right? Sheretz tumah only lasts until nightfall if you immerse that day. And this impurity imparted by a corpse is an impurity that lasts for 7 days. It is considered as though the impurity imparted by a corpse were placed in a vessel and he is impure. Or perhaps the fact that both a corpse and a creeping animal impart impurity means that it is one solid impurity. And because the creeping animal is floating, this person does not become impure from touching the corpse because he's more like he's touched a sheretz and he's not sure if he touched it. And if you say that due to their different levels of impurity, it is considered as though the impurity were placed in a vessel and therefore one is definitely impure, one can raise an additional dilemma. I'm going to, spoiler alert, all of these questions, which are very complicated questions, even the sages couldn't answer them. Where we're headed at the end of this series of questions is we don't know. The sages don't know, we don't know. And yes, you'll see. So it's a series of questions that go without answers. So, and if you say that due to their different levels of impurity, the sheretz and the corpse, so they are considered as though the impurity were placed in a vessel, and therefore one is definitely impure who touched this while he was in the water, and so was the body in the vessel, and now a body and a sheretz, a corpse and a sheretz. So one can raise an additional dilemma. If a creeping animal is atop a nevela, an unslaughtered animal carcass, meaning a kosher animal that was not slaughtered in a kosher manner, which is unkosher to eat and transmits tumah. So if a creeping animal is atop an unslaughtered animal carcass and the animal carcass is floating, then what is the law? Do we say that they are both examples of impurity for a day, so it is considered a single solid impurity? Or perhaps here too they are different, as this one, the carcass, renders items impure when it is in the amount of an olive bulk, and this one, the creeping animal, renders items impure when it is in the amount of a lentil bulk. In that case, the animal carcass and the creeping animal should be considered separate items, and it is as though the impurity is placed in a vessel and he should be impure. If in that case they are considered separate, then one can also ask, if a creeping animal is positioned atop another creeping animal, what is the law? Do we say that these certainly have the same measurement with regard to transmitting impurity and that they consequently should be viewed as a single floating item, which means that the person is pure? Or perhaps since they are separate from each other and are not in fact a single item, they are not considered as one unit. And if you say that in the case of a creeping animal atop another creeping animal, since they are separate from each other, it is considered as though the impurity were placed in a vessel and is not floating, one can raise an additional dilemma. If a creeping animal was placed atop an animal carcass that has dissolved, what is the law? Do we say that since it has dissolved, it has become like liquid and therefore it is as though the creeping animal were floating on liquid? Or perhaps this carcass is still considered food rather than a liquid and the creeping animal is on a solid surface? And if you say that a dissolved animal carcass is considered food, so one can raise an additional dilemma. If a creeping animal was placed on top of semen, which is certainly liquid, what is the law? Semen imparts impurity. Is this creeping animal considered a floating impurity? And if you say that once semen is ejaculated from the body, it is considered like food rather than liquid, as it is viscous, so one can raise an additional dilemma. If a creeping animal was placed atop waters of purification, i.e. the water into which the ashes of the red heifer are mixed, which becomes highly viscous, and the waters of purification are floating on water, what is the law? And the Gemara responds, we do not know the answer to any of these questions, and therefore the dilemmas shall stand unresolved. 64b. We're at the top of 64b. Rav Hamnuna says, in the case of a nazir and one performing the ritual of the Pesach, the paschal lamb or goat, who walked by a grave in the depths, right? Tumah of the deep, right? So one who is involved, he is a nazir, or he is involved in bringing the Passover sacrifice on the afternoon before Passover begins. Good timing for us. And during that day, he walked over a place that he later found out was Tumah of the deep, a theretofore unknown grave. And they did so, the Nazir or the one bringing the Paschal offering, walked over that unknown grave when on their 7th day of their purification, meaning 7 days after this, both this Nazir and this person involved in bringing the Pesach earlier had become impure for the dead. And then they're in the process of doing their 7-day purification, and they're on their 7th day. Okay, on the 7th day. And so 7 days after they were sprinkled with the purification waters, after having contracted ritual impurity imparted by a corpse. So these people are pure. Right? Now, this is interesting. They have not completed their purification. If they're on their 7th day, it means that they've observed the 7 days, they've been sprinkled on the 7th day, and maybe they've even immersed, but they're awaiting nightfall. That's when their 7-day purification is completed. So nightfall has not come yet. So these people are going to be pure, right? They contracted tumah of the deep on the 7th day of their purification. They later found out, and they've done everything of their 7-day purification from corpse tumah, but they're still awaiting nightfall. So these people are pure, meaning they did not become impure from the tumah of the deep. So if the Nazir shaved for his impurity and completed his Nazir's impurity, or if the one performing the ritual of the Paschal offering sacrificed his offering, then when he eventually discovers the impurity, it is considered as though he was pure all along, right? So even though they crossed over a grave, which would normally make them tameh, and therefore disqualified from bringing the Pesach, or, he's going to have to start over again in his purification so that he can continue his Naziris. But because it was tumah of the deep, we're saying no, it's as if it never happened, right? As if it never happened. And what is the reason for this lenient ruling? It is because the tumah, the ritual impurity imparted by a grave of the deep, right, a previously unknown grave, it is not strong enough to negate their actions, i.e. the Naziris offerings or the Paschal offerings. These people have brought their offerings, they did their whole action, and the tumah of the deep is not enough to say, no, you shouldn't have done it, go back and do it again. Now, Rava raised an objection to this ruling from the statement of the Mishna that if there is one whose impurity imparted by a grave of the deep, an unknown grave, that if it's uncertain whether that happened to him or not, and he descended to purify himself from the ritual impurity imparted by a corpse, he is impure, as a person or item that has a presumptive status of impurity remains impure. And one that has a presumptive status of purity remains pure. So this was talking about the guy who went to immerse in a mikveh that was in a cave. He had earlier become impure for the dead on the one hand, so he was impure and he went there to immerse to complete his purification, and then later found out that there was a corpse floating in that pool. That's like tumah of the deep. It's uncertain. Since he was going there to become purified, he doesn't become purified. On the other hand, the Nazir who went down into the cave to immerse just because it was a hot day, so he had not become impure previously. He's going down there in a state of purity. When he comes out, they discover that there was a corpse floating in that water. That's considered like tumah of the deep. And he does not become impure because when he went down there, he was pure and he remains pure. Right? If you went down impure, you remain impure. If you went down there pure, you remain pure. That's how they rule on this case of uncertainty, whether you came into contact with that corpse or not that was floating in the water. So here too, the Nazir and the one performing the ritual of the Pesach, these people had not completed their purification at the time, as the 7th day following their being sprinkled had not ended. So as their presumptive status is impure, so then they are retroactively rendered impure even by tumah of the deep. Right? Rav is saying, since if you go down into the cave and you were impure, then you didn't become purified in that mikvah. Okay, well, these people who are on their 7th day and nightfall hasn't come yet, they're not pure yet. They're still impure. So if they come into contact with tumah of the deep on that day, right, if they walk over this previously unknown grave on that day, they shouldn't be allowed to, make use of this leniency of tumah of the deep. Says Rava. Rav Hamnuna said to Rava, I agree with you with regard to a nazir who descended to purify himself and who is lacking the act of shaving. He has yet to shave his head for his impurity, right? A nazir who becomes impure for the dead has to do the 7-day purification, bring his offerings of impurity, and shave his head and start his naziris over again. So this person has yet to shave his head for his impurity, and he is therefore not completely pure. Consequently, he follows his prior presumptive status of impurity, and so we should not allow, he's going to have to redo his naziris, even though it was tumah of the deep. Rava said to him, I too agree with you with regard to one performing the ritual of the Pesach, that he is pure, as he is not lacking anything, since he does not have to perform any action on his body before he can bring an offering. He's just waiting for, right? The Nazir has to bring offerings for his impurity before he can become pure again. The one bringing the Pesach, he was impure for the dead the previous week. He did his 7-day purification. He immersed. All he's waiting for is nightfall. He doesn't have to do anything. At nightfall, he's automatically pure. And so therefore he should be qualified to bring the Pesach that night. So Rava says, I agree with you with regard to one performing the Pesach, that he is pure as he is not lacking anything. Since he does not have to perform any action on his body before he can bring an offering, one can say that he already has a presumptive status of purity on the 7th day. Well, Abaye said to Rava, but he is still lacking sunset. He's not going to be completely pure until sunset comes, right? So he's still part of his purification process, is awaiting sunset on his 7th day. So he is not fully pure until the sun sets. Rava said to Abaye, yeah, but the sun sets by itself. And therefore, this cannot be seen as a deficiency involving an action on the part of the one awaiting sunset. And the Gemara comments, and even Abaye accepted Rava's answer, and he retracted his objection, as can be seen from that which is taught in a Baraisa. By Torah law, a woman, and now they're going to just bring as an example the case of a woman who gives birth and the offerings that she has to bring, and we'll see how this is relevant. By Torah law, a woman who gives birth to a boy is ritually impure for 7 days, and a woman who gives birth to a girl is impure for 14 days. At that point, the woman immerses in a mikveh, in a ritual bath, and she's purified. And any blood that emerges from the woman during her days of purity, which is 40 days following the birth of a male and 80 days following the birth of a female, does not render her impure. If she has any kind of bleeding for 40 days after giving birth to a boy or for 80 days after giving birth to a girl, she is not rendered impure thereby. It is not considered that she's having her period again or spotting or anything. Any blood that emerges from her is just considered having to do with the birth and does not render her impure. And then at the end of that either 40-day period after giving birth to a boy or 80-day period after giving birth to a girl, she then brings certain offerings in the temple, the offerings brought by a mother after childbirth. And she cannot bring that offering of a woman who has given birth or miscarried. A woman who miscarries has to bring the same offerings, but she cannot bring those offerings until she has immersed at the end of these days. At the end of the 40 or the 80-day period, she immerses in the mikveh, and then she brings the offerings of a woman who has given birth. And the Baraisa discusses a case where a woman who had given birth became pregnant and miscarried before she had brought her offering for the first birth. Right, it's going to be no less than 40 days or 80 days, but it might be a while before she can get up to Jerusalem to bring those offerings. So in the meantime, she might have become pregnant and given birth again or miscarried again. So the Baraisa teaches if a woman miscarried on the day of the fulfillment of her purity, on the 81st day after a female, she must bring a separate offering for the miscarried fetus, as she was obligated to bring one offering before her miscarriage. If she miscarried during the fulfillment, i.e. before the conclusion of the 80 days before the birth of a daughter, she does not bring two offerings but only one, just as is the law in the case of one who gives birth to twins. So the Baraisa explains, one might have thought that she should not bring an offering for her childbirth, i.e. miscarriage that occurred before the fulfillment of the days of her purity, but she should bring for her childbirth that occurred after its completion. In other words, if she had yet another miscarriage after the days of her purity for her initial birth, but within the 80 days of purity following her first miscarriage, she should bring an extra offering and thereby discharge both obligations of her birth and her final miscarriage. Therefore, to counteract this possibility, you might have thought, but you'd be wrong. To counteract that thought, the verse states, and when the days of her purity are fulfilled, she shall bring. And this teaches that it is only if she miscarried on the day of the fulfillment itself that she must bring an offering for a miscarriage. But if she miscarried before the fulfillment of the days of her purity of an earlier miscarriage, even if this occurred more than 80 days after the first birth, she does not bring another offering. Right? So in other words, it's not that she hasn't brought her offerings yet, but within that 80-day period, right, when she's considered pure no matter what, I mean, yeah, exceptional circumstances, but she could have become pregnant and miscarried. So that's not going to restart the clock. There's not going to be yet another 80-day period. That's just considered, or actually, it can restart the clock for that second one, but she's not going to bring a second set of offerings. It's all going to be considered one long term of the days of her purity. And Rav Kahana said in explanation, I'm almost done. If you have questions or comments, get them in. Here it is different. The reason why she does not bring an offering for a miscarriage during her days of purity is that she lacks the possibility of bringing her offering. Since she cannot bring her offering until the end of her term of purity, she cannot incur another obligation during this period, no matter how many births occur within 80 days of the previous one. However, this leads Rav Kahana to ask, and there too, how is this relevant to the case of the Nazir? There too, if she had a miscarriage on the day of the completion of her term, she cannot bring her offering either because she lacks sunset, right? She won't be done fully pure until the 80th day ends at sunset. Why then must she bring an additional offering? See how they're connecting this to one who became tameh from the deep on the 7th day of his purification, awaiting sunset. And Abaye said to Rav Kahana, the sun sets by itself and is not considered a deficiency with regard to her purity. And this discussion shows that Abaye accepted Rava's reasoning as he submitted the same argument himself in a different context, meaning that if a person is only lacking sunset to become fully pure, then it's as if he is already pure. He's not going to be able to enter the temple until the sun sets. But if, circumstances happen to him, which might obligate him to bring an offering for becoming impure, but, if he was already impure, but he's not, he's considered that he's still impure, but he's not, he's considered to be pure if the only thing he's waiting for is sunset. That's what I've got for us today. Let's do some questions or comments. On Nazir 64. Reminder, while I'm waiting for the questions to load up, that we will do page 65 tomorrow, page 66 on Thursday, but we won't finish page 66. We'll save the final passage to make a siyum on the morning before Passover, and we'll publish the holiday schedule of AT Daily in a few days, and we'll send it out in the email bulletin, the regular AT bulletin. If you're not subscribed to it, it's a weekly email. It's awesome. You should definitely be subscribed to it. Nina writes 2 little spectacular Torah commentaries every week. It includes the table for 5, some humor, some history, the Thursday hero, whatever else is going on, a summary of what we did the week before on AT Daily, and in cases like this, the schedule, right? So you want to definitely be in touch with us. Subscribe to the AT Bulletin. Nina put the link in the comments, and you can also find it at accidentaltalmudist.org. Okay, questions on 64. Does a boat going unknowingly over a shipwreck become impure? I don't know. I don't know. I mean, the question is like the person in the vessel insulated from whatever corpses might be down below? I mean, like, I'm kind of guessing not. I mean, I'm also wondering, like, if you just go swimming and you look down with your mask on, you look down, and, oh my God, there's a shipwreck down there, and there might be a body down there. Sounds like then you did become impure for the dead, but I'm just not, at the at the tip of my tongue, well versed in those kind of nuances of corpse tumah. But it's a great question. Great question. Joseph, is it impure to touch a creeping thing at any time or just when visiting the temple? So first of all, let's remember that we're talking about dead creeping things, right? Dead creeping things. And it's not all insects that transmit tumah, right? We should just, I should look it up. It's not like every creeping thing. I forget which, grasshoppers can actually be kosher for eating. Most insects are, those are the only kind of insects that I think that are kosher, and only some grasshoppers. But generally speaking, which creeping things, when dead, impart tumah. They impart tumah at any time. Why is that tumah relevant? Because if you came into contact with it, you cannot enter the temple. And because if you become tameh and then you touch teruma. Now, I don't know if, you become tameh if you touch a creeping thing. Does your tumah then transmit to food? Maybe. I can't remember. But certainly if a sheretz, right, fell into an oven, it's going to render the oven impure. If a sheretz fell into teruma, it's going to render the teruma impure and disqualified for eating by a priest. So it's not only with respect to entering the grounds of the temple when the temple is standing that touching a sheretz is a dead creeping thing is relevant, but there are other matters where impurity matters also. Sam, this was one of the revolutionary proclamations of Torah, protecting newborns in general and newborn girls specifically. Other cultures did not protect newborns to this extent. I mean, there were so many things, right, that came into the world with the advent of Torah. It was such a gift from God, not just to us, but to the whole world. In fact, Nina just went out in the AT email bulletin today, if you didn't already get it, that our parsha this week is Tzav, and Nina wrote that Tzav means command, right? So this week's Torah portion opens with God telling Moshe to command Aaron and the Kohanim, the priests, in certain matters. And on this word itself, Tzav, right? So Tzav, command, same root as mitzvah, commandment. So the word itself doesn't only mean command, it also has a sense of connect, right? And so, sometimes we feel like all the commandments that we are obligated in can feel like a burden, right? But rather than view it that way, we should recognize that every mitzvah, every commandment is not just an opportunity, to do what you're told and to perform what you're obligated to perform according to the Torah, but it is itself a bridge, a connection to God. We come closer to God. We connect ourselves to God by fulfilling His will. And every mitzvah is an opportunity to connect with the Holy One above. Right? So we should always be grateful that we were given the commandments. And if you're not Jewish, then you're obligated in the 7 Noahide commandments, which are really categories. They're very large categories. And so, for example, one of the first commandment that it obligates all human beings is to know God, right? To come closer to God, to know about God, to learn about God. So that would be Torah study, right? So in learning about Scripture and learning from the Torah and Tanakh, we are connecting to God. And it's just such a beautiful thing that God commands us to do that. It shows that God wants us, loves us, and wants us to be in relationship with God. That's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Wednesday at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.